now we're gonna immediately move on to the first keynotes on the why and the how of 100% renewable energy islands. And Alexis Chatzimpiros, I'm starting to learn after 3 years, will guide us to that, give an introduction, and then we have some keynotes. And in our proposal, we had said that 100% renewable energy islands is our North Star. You know, it's our guiding star where we work towards to. We know there's obstacles on the road and so forth, but you know, we need a direction, and that's our direction. And the Samsø Energy Academy and Samsø Island is one of these islands who pioneered very early and is already very far advanced. And I know that's slightly risky, but in religious terms, you could say clean energy is our God, and the Samsø Energy Academy is the prophet. So, Alexis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Originally, I'm from Greece, and I work at the Samsø Energy Academy. So you may have heard of Samsø hitting the news many times. It's a 4,000 inhabitants island in Denmark, which is known for its community-driven clean energy transition. It's carbon negative since 2007. All the electricity comes from onshore wind, 11 megawatt in total. Almost all the heating comes from district heating and local biomass. The rest is some solar thermal. And then there's the highest number of electric vehicles per capita in Denmark. And all the emissions from transport on the island and to and from are at the moment compensated through offshore winds, so 23 megawatt, and Samsø owns all of it. So all these investments were organized and were achieved with local ownership. So the question we get all the time is, how did you do it? So which also brings me to the title of this session, and I'd like to briefly introduce you to the why and how, but from an island and local perspective. So how did we do it? So if you think about it, that's what I just described. So we used wind energy, solar energy, and local biomass, and bank loans. That's the how. So how is about technology and is about market conditions. And this is not the best conversation starter when you talk to a community. Because technology, I mean, wind turbines and PV, some people would just love them and say, yes, we need climate change is there, we need to act today, we need to be the first ones, pioneers. Eo said we should be bold. But then many others will just hate it. And they will say, oh, climate change, you know, we're too small for this. And then there are big emitters, big countries. They just have to deal with it. They created the problem. It's not for me, the problem. So that brings me to the why, because this is a very, very interesting question. So the technology question about different technologies, it's very divisive. And if you've ever been to a public meeting, then you know that introducing a divisive topic, it's probably your worst nightmare. You may as well call it a day and just go home. So, but the why question is interesting from a community perspective. So why do I do this? Why should I do this? Why should we do this? What's in it for me? So can you guess what was the first reaction on Samsø for people when the idea of 100% renewable energy island was introduced for the first time in 1997? Can you guess? It was in your dreams, it would never happen. But then gradually there were some local regions that emerged. There were some who primed the idea, but then people felt connected to the local regions, and the solution, the clean energy transition of the island felt like a solution to local problems, which was like new business, stable energy prices, a stronger local economy, more tourists, widespread, so expansion also of the tourist season. We get around 5,000 extra visitors. We call them energy visitors. So we had to build the Energy Academy to have somewhere to host them per year. So this suddenly becomes interesting. And it's not anymore about that crazy idea, that fancy idea and me. It's not about me and them. It kind of creates some mental feeling of ownership at some point. And it becomes my project too, if I'm a resident, whether I have invested personally or not, because it serves a local purpose. So, and then we can talk about how. So how can we then do it? Well, with wind, with solar, and local biomass, and bank loans. So the technology and the market conditions are there. And on Samsø, we started like in the early 2000s. And at the time, there was no discussion about electric ferries. There was no discussion about electric vehicles, no batteries. It was crazy expensive. So we stuck to what was commercially available in the market. That's why the offshore compensates for all the emissions from transport. Now we're working towards becoming fossil-free completely, going down to zero by 2030. But at the time, it was not possible. So we didn't do rocket science. We just stuck to what was commercially available. And that brings me to the speakers of this session. So we're going to hear from the Balearic Islands, from Shetland, from Euroheat, and Islands of Innovation. And they will give their own angles and perspectives in this from citizens, island communities, the industry, and a global perspective as well. So thank you, and without further ado, I would like to invite Pau de Vilchez Moragues to take the floor. Thank you. Do I get one of these? Yeah, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And thank you very much for pushing for the energy transition. And since we are in Estonia, I would like to start by giving some literary advice. I would recommend a book by an Estonian writer whose name is Andrus Kivirähk. I don't know if it's well pronounced, but he wrote that fantastic book called The Man Who Spoke Snakish. I should really recommend you to read it, because it's also about a time when things were changing and nothing was the same evermore. Beyond that, I only had 3 hours slept last night, so I'm more coherent than I will be today, but I'll try to be as coherent as I can. I'll try to convey to you 5 or 6 key ideas, and my aim is to broaden and deepen the focus of this forum and beyond. The first idea is that of urgency. I mean, we don't need to talk about the climate emergency because we all know that it's there. But what about the urgency to act? 8 years ago, in the Paris Agreement, all states set a goal of containing the increase in global mean temperature to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And the agreement was, at the scientific level at least, was that 1.5 was really the goal to aim at. Why? Because beneath 1.5, we had the tools actually to adapt and to prosper and to live in a 1.5 warmer world. But beyond 1.5 come tipping points. Not only the consequences of climate change become harsher and more unpredictable, the problem is that it gets beyond our hands, because tipping points is something that we cannot actually act upon. We can act upon how our energy systems work, how do we move, how do we produce, how much we consume, but we cannot act if the Amazon forest starts pushing back all the CO2 it has absorbed through the years. So the problem is that in 2018, 2017, we were saying, well, we have 12, 13 years to get our emissions, to cut our emissions by half. in order to have a 66% chance to keep global warming to 1.5. And half that time has passed. And not only are we not nearer cutting half of our emissions by 2030, but we're still increasing these emissions. So there is really an urgency in terms of addressing climate change or what is causing it. So there is no sense in kidding ourselves, and we really need to change. It is urgent. And change means, of course, decarbonizing the energy system and decarbonizing our transport system, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond electrifying. It means also doing less things with less. It means not only producing more renewable energy, it means needing less energy. And it means less of everything, in fact. And this leads me to the notion of planetary boundaries. I don't know if you're familiar with the notion. The Stockholm Resilience Center created the concept like 10 years ago. And it refers to 9 natural boundaries that are necessary in order to have a safe space for humanity to thrive and prosper. And we are nowadays past 6 of these boundaries. Last week, the Stockholm Resilience Center developed or published a new report on the planetary boundaries. And it added a new dimension, not only about what is safe for us, but about what is just, about equity. And it's important because they have realized through studying all the energy systems and ecosystems and the way we humans interact with nature, that either we introduce justice in the way we act, or it's impossible to actually be sustainable. I mean, they said literally, a just and equitable approach is essential to planetary stability. And this is a scientific conclusion. It is not a policy choice. So what do we do with that? So we have urgency. We have the need to actually introduce justice and equity. And there is the fact that there is no alternative to change. And this is my third idea. So the thing is, we need to change. And many people don't want to. For instance, in the Balearic Islands, where I come from, we have changed many things in the last few years. We reduced the speed in the city rings for cars, and people went crazy. I mean, the difference between 120 kilometers per hour or 80 kilometers per hour for people was like going nuts. And people are, no, I don't want to change. But the thing is that we all need to change. In fact, it's not that we need to change, it's that things will change. Either we like it or not. Things are already changing. Temperature is changing, rainfall patterns are changing, crop yields are changing. So things are changing, either we like it or not. And that's a starting point. The starting point is not between business as usual and some kind of change. It's between change and change. It's between a change that we decide among ourselves, that is planned. It is a change that can bring additional benefits and lead to a better life for all of us, or it is a change that is not planned, that is not sustainable, that is not just, and it will wreak havoc on our societies. So, to make people change, you really need to involve them. You need to make them agents of change. And it is not just enough to make good policy for the people. You need to make good policy with the people. And this is key. And we have a perfect example of this in the Balearic Islands. There were the elections 2 weeks ago, and the government had done a really, really nice job in terms of deploying renewables and making them available for people, pushing for shared self-consumption, and really, transport was free, road transport, public transport. I mean, amazing things that really improved the lives of people. Well, there were the elections, and there has been a complete overhaul by the right, and most worrying, the extreme right, which are climate deniers. So it's not enough to make good policies. It's not enough to make good policies for the people. You really need to bring the people in. And we have done interesting experiences. For instance, we have run a citizens' climate assembly in Mallorca, which has been great, and participants are now active actors of change, organizing conferences, debates, and everything in all towns of the island, but this is not enough. We need to go further than that. In an era of increased mistrust and individuality, we really need to build community. We really need to build communities. This, I think, is the main reason why we are here. And this, to me, should be the leitmotif of this forum and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pau. And maybe I should have invited the rest of you to the panel. So please, Reuben Irvine from Yell Islands and Shetland, and Pauline Lucas from Euroheat and Power, and James Ellsmoor, if you want to join. Yes, yes, please. Sorry, I didn't do that earlier. So yes, Pau, you talked a lot about change, and I mean, we also say that if everything is changing around us, we also need to change in order to stay the same and to maintain some way of life that we similar to what we knew, not exactly the same, but otherwise going towards completely different direction. Yes, so thank you very much for this. And yes, Reuben, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Excellent. So I have a few slides as well. So I have quite a few things I would quite like to say today, so I'll try to go quite quickly. I'm here to speak about the Carbon Neutral Islands project. So that's a Scottish Government project. But I would also like to tell you about my island specifically, which is Yell, and hopefully go quite briefly over the other 5 islands that are part of the project. But yeah, my name is Reuben Irvine. I've met some of you already. It's really lovely to be in Saaremaa. It's quite interesting to see how connected islands are. I noticed when we got here that the ferry that we got here was built in the same shipyard as the ferry that services our island as well. So, and also we're here in the Thule Coda, which is named after Ultima Thule, and there's quite a lot of people who think that it might be an island in Shetland as well. So there's connections everywhere. We're all surrounded by the sea. How do I get on to the next slide? So these are the 6 CNI islands and the motivation behind the project. So the project is based on a commitment by the Scottish Government to make 6 Scottish islands carbon neutral by 2040. So I have them on the map. I didn't have room to put the map on every slide, so you will have to memorise where they all are. There might be a test at the end. But it's really hoped that the project will sort of lead the way with decarbonisation of islands, and it will also help deliver the Scottish Government's National Islands Plan. So it's a very exciting project to be involved in. So yeah, I'll give you a bit of background on Yell. This is my island. It's the 2nd most northerly inhabited Scottish island, so quite far north. We get the Gulf Stream, which helps keep us quite warm, warmer than you might think in the winter, quite mild winters, cool summers, I will admit. But we're also blasted by the jet stream, so it's very, very windy. And as you can see, for the area and also by the population, it's quite sparsely populated. The population is quite around the edge of the island, so there's quite a few distinct communities in Yell. So it's a very, very interesting place to come for. In terms of energy, Yell has quite a strategic place in the North Isles. It's an important hub going to other islands, so it's a hub for transport. We also have Garth Wind Farm, which is a community-owned wind farm up in the north of Yell. So that's a 4.5 megawatt wind farm. And we also have Nova has a tidal array between Yell and Unst. So that produces 300 kilowatts of tidal power. And there's two much larger proposed projects, one in the north and one in the south of Yell, which are proposed to be built by Statkraft in the years to come. But I thought you'd be interested to see, we actually are a net exporter of renewable energy. So we consume about half, a little less than half, of all the energy we produce. So overall, we're a net exporter of green energy. But of course, if the wind's no blowing, we are connected to the grid. So we do import energy as well. I think you can see for the amount of capacity that we have now, and the fact that it's more than we use, we have quite a job to figure out what we'll do with all the energy that's set to come in the future. So there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had with what we can do. One of the things we've done with the Carbon Neutral Islands project is an assessment of our emissions. Our biggest emission source is actually land use, which we think is coming from degraded peat. But we're hoping to do a more in-depth assessment. We also have quite a bit of energy emissions, largely because Shetland isn't connected to the national grid, so our emissions factor is quite high for Shetland. And within transport, about half our transport emissions are from our ferries. So, where are we at with the Carbon Neutral Islands project? Well, we've done carbon audits, so we've assessed where the islands are at, and we've worked with the communities on each of the 6 islands, and we've put together community climate action plans. So it's really looking at what the community would like to do and the decarbonisation goals that they would like to act on in the years to come. And the real hope there is that it can be a bottom-up process, and that we can sort of drive it forward with what the islands would like to see. And the next phase is to figure out how we're going to do it, how we're going to pay for it, how we're going to make it happen. So there's quite a bit of feasibility and investment study to be done there, and actually get things on the ground, which is quite an exciting point to be at. And we're hoping to launch the community climate action plans in the next few weeks, so you'll need to keep an eye out for that one as well. So just a quick summary on some of the other islands as well. So Barra, it's the most southerly of the Outer Hebrides. They also have a community-owned wind turbine, and similarly to Garth, the profits are reinvested into the community in Barra. So that's quite a common model for community-owned wind, is charitable ownership and to reinvest into islands. We've got Cumbrae. It's a popular holiday destination. It's one of the best connected islands, so quite close to Glasgow, and an economy quite heavily based in tourism. Hoy and Walls up in Orkney. Again, the Hoy Development Trust has a community-owned wind turbine. Profits being reinvested in the community. One of the projects they're working on now is the Legacy project, so they're investing in domestic solar to try and alleviate fuel poverty on the island, so helping households get solar panels. We've got Islay, it's the second last of our projects. It's the biggest of the islands, and both in terms of population and in terms of area. A lot of you will know Islay. It's quite famous for its whiskey. So it's very well known as well. And similarly to Yell, they have quite a bit of land use emissions. And finally, we've got Raasay, the smallest, putting the smallest and the biggest next to each other. The Raasay community have built a micro-hydro scheme, and as somebody was mentioning this morning, grid capacity is an issue for them as well. So they're restricted in what they can produce by the capacity of the grid. But once it's upgraded, they'll be able to produce the full capacity of their hydro scheme. So we're near an end. Sort of some of the key findings that we found for the carbon auditing process. In energy, it's mostly domestic energy, and particularly oil. In Shetland, we have quite a high grid capacity, grid factor. So using energy on the Shetland grid is quite carbon intensive compared to other areas. Across all the islands, ferries are quite a big source of emissions. You'll find that if you look at your islands as well and you've got ferries, quite a few folk are quite envious of Faroe for that one. So tunnels might be the answer. Some people would quite like to see that. But at the moment, ferries are quite a big source of our emissions. And in terms of land use, we would like to do a more in-depth assessment of the land use. It's quite a considerable emission source across all the islands, but it's also one of the most uncertain at the moment. So I'm nearing the end. I'll leave you with this one. We would really like the islands to sort of be able to lead the way in decarbonisation and in island-led approaches to decarbonisation. So we would love to share the lessons learned and to make progress together. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Reuben, for bringing these examples. Sorry.
I think she wants to turn the screen.
Can we turn
Okay.
So that she can see it.
Oh,
the middle one?
do you want to stand there? Yeah. So thanks for bringing these examples. I mean, I think Scotland is a good practice of a country that supports its islands, and this carbon neutral or nation carbon neutral islands initiative is great. I wish we had it in every single country in Europe. And I also noticed that in every slide of yours there was like the community development officer, like in bold letters. So that's to remind us that behind every project and behind every plan there is a person, and actually that's what makes the difference between a plan or a clean energy transition agenda, which is just a desktop exercise, or something that is really being worked on by a community and will lead to results. So thank you for pointing this out. And yes, Pauline, the floor is yours. Pauline Lucas from Euroheat and Power.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Alexis. I'm afraid I don't have any beautiful pictures of islands, but instead I will talk to you about heating and cooling, and I was pleased actually to hear Eero here from the Commission also reminding us that it's also an important aspect aside of electricity. So yes, I'm Pauline, and just to give you a little bit of context where I'm from, so I'm from European Trade Association representing district heating and cooling. So we worked with the EU institution in the decision-making process, and we're also involved in many EU-funded projects. So we have 150 members across all the value chain of district heating and cooling. But actually, you may wonder, what is district heating and cooling? So I guess all of you took a warm shower either yesterday or this morning. So it was actually probably provided by the district heating of Saaremaa. There is one on the island, many actually. And so district heating is about providing hot water and heating from a centrally produced heat source. So it can be, of course, it's still a lot of fossil fuels. We will see that, but also decarbonized sources, renewables such as geothermal, solar thermal, sustainable biomass, etc. So this is in a nutshell, you produce the heat and then you distribute it to buildings through insulated pipes. So that's pretty simple. So yes, Alexis was mentioning the how, the why and the how. So this is a little bit of the why we should care about heating and cooling. So it is well known now that it is half of the energy consumption in the EU, and it is thermal energy is mostly used by buildings, so households or commercial buildings as well. And as I said, still mostly heating and cooling is provided by fossil fuels type of energy versus so mainly from this, it's still natural gas, around 40%, and only 23% of this is renewable. So it really gives you the size of the challenge. And when it comes to islands, I think we are all facing an energy crisis. We noticed increased prices in the winter, difficulties attached to security of supply, and I really believe that whatever effects that we are feeling from this energy crisis, that is, by the way, a heat crisis, islands are feeling it even more acutely. So it's also becoming an even bigger challenge to transition from these fossil fuels on islands. So it comes to the how, and I think Alexis also pointed out that yeah, for Samsø it was also a little bit of a dream at the beginning. So that's why I put like this sort of dreamy picture, but in reality there are already many existing sources, and we will come to that. But just another visualization, we've been focusing a lot on decarbonizing the electricity sector, but actually the immersed part of the iceberg is the heating and cooling part, and also the transport part, as we will discuss through this forum. But it's really the big part of the challenge. So here it's just to illustrate this, how to make, because the big question is how to make our energy systems resilient. And we've seen that we have started successfully to decarbonize a big share of electricity, and it's also going on in islands with the solar and the wind resources. So we have achieved about 37% of renewable in electricity, which is like substantially higher than heat. But I think to ensure resiliency of systems, we need to rely on diversified energy sources, so not put all our eggs in the same basket, so to say. And the heat transition can also not be a byproduct of the electricity decarbonization. So we already see examples of where a lack of diversification could pose a problem. So for instance, we had Norway that massively electrified and was a net producer, but now will face in a couple of years probably a deficit in its electricity production. Or in Czechia, there is solar capacity, but there was at some point no demand for the renewable production, so they had to just unplug the solar from the grid, which has led to curtailing, and which is basically a waste. So for this, we really see the need to diversify. And so some sector obviously will need electrification. There is no question behind that. We talked about ferries, transport, so that's very clear. But for heating, for instance, there are many other alternatives that can also have other benefits to provide this flexibility from the electricity grid. And we see for islands it is also an issue. So coming to the how. A very crowded slide, but I will try to lead you through it. So we do have a variety of sustainable and local and heat and energy sources. So this is all what we can use from this existing solution toolbox. So for instance, we have what we talked about, renewable electricity from solar and wind, but we also have renewable heat, so geothermal, solar thermal, bioenergy, etc. We also have something that is fairly untapped, but which is excess heat or waste heat. So from buildings, when you cool the buildings, you can extract the heat, or from metro station, probably less relevant for islands, or sewer system, that's relevant for any city that has a sewer system, so you can extract heat from there as well. Or very relevant for islands, free cooling from river, sea, and lake. So in the split session, I will give an example on that. It's quite interesting. So we have a lot of possible sources, and then we have grids. So we talk a lot about grids. We have heat grids and electricity grids. And our belief also as district heating, as we are an infrastructure, is that we can really tap into these synergies between the grid, also through storage. But not only battery storage, but also thermal storage. And I will also give later on an example in the split session. So the idea is there, I think, as another speaker pointed out, to really capitalize on the resources and tap into these resources that are already there, to really have resource efficiency and build on the strength of the local context. So to conclude, heat diversification, what kind of benefits does it bring? So first, it enables to boost the share of renewable in the heat supply, so decarbonizing electricity, but also heat grid. It increases the flexibility, so when you produce excess renewable electricity and you have no use in your electricity system, you can store this also through thermal storage, for instance. It's much cheaper, and quite efficient. So you can store this within a day or within very much larger period of time. And all of this leads also to lowering the cost of the transition. And well, I think that was also one of the points raised in the introduction. It's a crucial point. So we have a lot of untapped resources, but don't take my word for it. I do a little advertisement for the discussion session here. I will present 2 cases that are really illustrating how this toolbox can be really put to work and in practice what it means in the heating and the cooling sector. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for highlighting also how we can make use of resources locally available to complement what can be electrified for heating and cooling. Thank you. So the floor is yours, James.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'll stand over here if that's okay to be able to see the slides. Are my slides going to appear? Well, my name is James Ellsmoor. I'm from an organization called Island Innovation, and I'll be giving a bit of global context to this conversation around 100% renewable energy. So 2 questions that I wanted to raise for you. It was 3, but I got told 10 minutes, so I'll reduced it down. What are some of the lessons from the global island context, which in itself could be a PhD thesis? So again, in brief, actually, it nearly was my PhD thesis, but I decided not to go down the academic route. How do I go back? And second question, how can this Clean Energy for EU Islands project help to redefine innovation on the so-called periphery, and what does that mean? So just quickly about Island Innovation, we're a global network focused on sustainable development for islands. We have a team of 18 living on islands around the world, from Brazil to Trinidad and Tobago, Guadeloupe, Azores, Philippines, and different parts of Europe as well. And we're a specialized agency on communications and strategy, again, focused on sustainable development. And I'm also here in part through the support of Friesland, who we work with, to work with them on their hopeful application to this project. So thank you to Professor Han Brezet for the support to be here today. So the first question, what are some of the lessons from this global island context? There are many islands in the world, and many of these islands are going through some of the similar challenges that many of your islands are too. So even though the Caribbean or the Pacific or Indonesia, the South Atlantic may seem very different, many of the challenges, many of those opportunities are very similar. And so there's an opportunity here to share lessons, learn from, and exchange ideas with not only other islands in Europe, but some of these other island regions around the world. One very obvious challenge is generation costs, especially for islands that are isolated grids, are very high. This is more illustrative, it's a little bit out of date, but you get the idea that generation costs for electricity in the Caribbean are anywhere from 2 to 4 times higher than the same costs in the United States. I'm sure that's a problem for many of you working on islands with isolated grids as well. And specifically for many small island nations, there is a dependency on oil, imported oil. And in many cases, that can take up anywhere from 5 to 30% of the GDP being spent on importing petroleum. So there's a big energy security question here. Again, these figures are a little out of date, but they illustrate the idea that a slight increase in oil prices can really jeopardize island economies in a pretty disastrous way. And so another great argument for renewables. When it comes to 100%, about 10 years ago, there was a slew of announcements for islands declaring that they're going to be the first to reach 100%. I've heard at least 3 or 4 islands claim to be the first, so there's definitely a competition there over how we define that. Many different places around the world had claimed these. Some of them have really succeeded. Many of them are still on the way. So one example of this was Aruba in the Caribbean, pledged to reach 100% by 2020. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. We're now 2023, and with a long way to go there. And I think there are some important lessons from some of these pledges that were made in the 2010s. Often politics gets in the way of reality, as was the case in Aruba, where when the government changed, so did the policy and priorities as well. And there are many other examples of other islands looking into, or have over the last 10, 15 years, pledged 100% and not quite got there. But also many that have, and I think a lot of promising examples, some of which are in the room that we can learn from there. One interesting example for me, which is one of the potential titles holders of the first to reach 100%, is Tokelau. I don't know how many people here. Raise your hand if you have heard of Tokelau before. 5 or 6 people. Okay, good. Tokelau is a fascinating example where they reached 100% renewables, or solar specifically, with battery storage in 2012. An island, 3 islands of about 1,200 people in total, but with the challenge of being about a 2-day boat ride from the nearest other island and the nearest airport. So logistically, a big challenge. You can see here where Tokelau is. Tokelau did reach 100% renewables, and within 12 months, no longer was at 100% and went down to around 60, 70%. Part of this was because after being on 6 or 7 hours of electricity per day, all of a sudden islanders had access to 24 hours of electricity per day. So a huge lifestyle change, which was fantastic for people living there. Guess what the first thing that everyone bought when they reached 24 hours of electricity? Any guesses? A freezer. But close. Air conditioning, I'm sure, was installed too. So even though on installing, actually they installed 100%, 150% of estimated demand, once everyone on the island bought a fridge freezer, they immediately dropped, and I don't think they ever got back to 100%, although on their website it does claim still 100% first solar. So again, I think not at all to diminish the achievement that was made there. I think a very important achievement, and still a significant amount of energy coming from solar. But sometimes there are unintended consequences which are hard to predict, even when you do estimate 150%. Okay, question 2. I have no idea how I am on time, by the way. I'll get moving. So one of the opportunities here in redefining how islands are positioned when we talk about the so-called periphery is showcasing replicable solutions. I think that came up earlier. Not just solving solutions for islanders themselves, but also showcasing what are the bigger opportunities. I think this is a really good way for islands to leverage funding and showcase their role on the larger scale, and it's something that we see a lot. We have to be very careful, I think, about the language that we use. So often I hear laboratories, and that is a term that I think we have to be careful with, but also the term lighthouses, which the International Renewable Energy Agency use when talking about their projects in small island states. Lighthouses that demonstrate looking into the future and has a positive tone, as opposed to laboratories, which sounds like you're being experimented on and not always has the right connotations, I think, because we know that projects that are locally driven and have the local buy-in are going to be the ones that are most successful and have the most longevity. So there's a real power in this imagery of green islands. This is something that's been used to leverage many islands. The knock-on effect of green islands, or 100%, goes far beyond the obvious economic benefits. Even to tourism, branding, leveraging innovation and funding for other aspects, promoting an island as a center of innovation and leadership, and green can really have this impact across the whole economy. For many of the small island nations, they have been able to leverage their projects in renewable energy to create a larger call for action. So I think Alexis mentioned that many islanders say, well, our contribution to carbon is negligible. Why does it matter if we go 100% renewable? Well, of course, we know there are economic benefits locally, but also there is a wider story of setting an example and promoting leadership. And so that's what this is. Simon Kofe from Tuvalu in the South Pacific. They use their renewable energy projects, even though the whole nation has 12,000 people, but when they're at the United Nations to say, look at what we're doing, if we can do it, you can too. And I think that has is a powerful story. So I'll leave you with the words of the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who I think is one of the most inspiring leaders in the world of islands, and has also really promoting the use of renewables and the green transition in Barbados. And she said, as islanders, we know that to live is to share, to be creative, and to be resourceful. That's our life. And I think that really sums up the message that we need to hear of island leadership when it comes to renewable energy. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you during the week.
Thank you very much, James, for bringing the global perspective in the discussion. And thank you all for being sharp and to the points. Despite starting quite late, we managed to finish almost on time. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you. And indeed, a great variety of ways into clean energy for EU Island. And I appreciated very much the different setup and different content of the presentation, because it shows there's not just one way and one topic. It's not only electricity, it's also heating and cooling, very important point. Also, our Scottish friends, unfortunately, we can no longer help you or support you, but we can still be inspired by you. So that's also good. And then the global context and the why that Paul laid out. Thank you very much.